Dun, 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 dun. The Hangout on Air is live. Do you want to actually check the link to see whether or not it's actually working?
Sure.
We have 0 viewers, so it's really not a big deal.
Oh, I just hit the Slack group again. Let's see here. Nope, that didn't work. Interesting. Copy URL.
Good timing. My
Twitter my Twitter client is not doing what it's supposed to. It keeps going to http://apis.slack.com because it's not handling well 2 links in the same tweet, which is weird.
The battery on my mouse just died.
Well, are we live now? Oh yeah,
and we're live. Yes, it's okay. We have 1 viewer, 1 poor sucker.
Okay, so we can say the viewing is working.
Apparently, the viewing is working. We have people.
All right. So now we look like idiots. All right, let's not look like idiots.
Tell us something new. Glenn, we're back.
Yes, we are.
HTTP after a short 2-year hiatus.
Just very short. You didn't even notice it.
Well, really, there's not a whole lot changed with HTTP in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think.
Right? So.
Well, that's true, but we've had some interesting things happening in that time. GraphQL. Anyway.
You can see where this is going. So tell me, where are you these days? What are you doing, and why did we decide to start this all up again?
I can answer those in a different order.
Okay.
We decided to start this up again because we had a really good time last time, and then life happened, and then we realized, a lot of people like this. We enjoy doing it. I just had a coworker. My coworker Jeff was asking me, what is it about? I said it's car talk for HTTP, and that is what it is. So,
maybe we aspire to be that.
It has to be. Well, yes, aspire is a good point. I'm not. Yeah. Car Talk is certainly a unique show. As far as what I'm doing, I am working at Auth0, and I've been working on this new product we brought to market called Auth0 Extend. And why it's interesting from an API perspective is what we're pushing on with Auth0 Extend is enabling SaaS products to be more easily customized. And we do that by embedding another word that wasn't very popular 2 years ago, an embedded serverless platform that provides an experience that allows a customer to go into a SaaS product like a CRM and just author custom business rules right inside the product. So very similar to what we've done within Auth0. A lot of people love the fact that in Auth0 you can write Auth0 rules. We've genericized that and realized that there's a common pattern that products want this capability. And so we've delivered a new service into the market that provides that. So APIs are very central to it because the idea is everything that you author using Auth0 Extend essentially becomes an API endpoint. So it's kind of bringing API authoring very wide, although these APIs tend to be more an implementation detail as part of the usage of a SaaS application, as opposed to a public-facing API that's directly consumed by tons of different clients. Anyway, it's been a lot of fun and interesting. The other reason I think this has to go on is my love for APIs still continues, and so I want to keep talking about them.
Well, serverless is definitely the hot topic these days, and if we can get a little bit of HTTP into more people's lives, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is interesting. I mean, I actually do think that things like serverless are helping to cross the chasm, so to speak, in the sense that it is bringing a lot more people into HTTP without even knowing it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. But every now and again, you do need to dig under the covers, and it's kind of handy to know how things work under the covers.
Agreed. No, totally agree. The only other thing I wanted to mention is I thought it was good to just set a little bit of context of for people who may not know me, like why I'm even here. So I've been around the API space for I think now about 7 or 8 years. My first real exposure to APIs was when I was at Microsoft. I worked on this thing that you might have heard of if you're in the .NET world, which is called Web API. And at that time, we were really trying to come up with a new way of building HTTP services on the Microsoft stack. And that started my journey into the API world. And I've kind of kept there in various aspects. So yeah, that's me.
And that's how we really got to know each other, right? Because you dragged me into that whole thing. So we had a lot of fun.
I don't know who dragged who. You certainly dragged me into the space, but I maybe dragged you into the effort that we had going on at Microsoft. And
yeah, and then
you were fortunate.
Now we've swapped places, and now I'm working at Microsoft,
which is super. I don't want to say ironic, but interesting. Yes, very interesting.
So I'm still working on the same team that I was 2 years ago, working on the API management team. Although I have had a change of role. I was previously an evangelist for the team, and now I'm a code monkey. I'm writing code on the team, and thoroughly enjoying myself. So as long as I can stay in the API world and dealing with HTTP, I'm a happy camper.
Well, I was really excited because you were one of the people that I really looked at as an example of like, hey, people have been doing this for a long time. This stuff really works. Of course, hypermedia was a big attraction, a big, I would say, eye-opening thing for me when I first started to learn like what REST was. Going away from the pop culture definition and then realizing this thing that's actually been there almost like the air that we breathe, but I just never really thought about it. And that was that had a profound impact on me. And in terms of, I was very excited to see that you went to Microsoft because you were coming from the outside with a different perspective. And so you're still driving on that.
That comes up every now and again.
Oh, so that doesn't always go in your favor. Yeah,
No, not always have the same perspective as some of the people in Microsoft. But that's okay.
And kudos on the open API stuff too. I mean, I think that's obviously something that's gaining huge traction, and having your involvement there and your bringing more of your dissenting opinions is probably a healthy.
Yeah, so that is a big change in my life insofar as I've come from a hypermedia background, and now I'm fairly intimately involved in working on the Open API, formerly known as Swagger specification, and we brought that to a version 3 the middle of this year. So we added a bunch of nice new stuff into the version 3 of that spec, and now we are starting to get lots of people building tooling around it. So hopefully we'll see a lot more adoption of the V3 spec in the coming months.
Awesome.
So this is all about Q&A.
Another topic we could throw on here if we have time.
Yes.
Let's talk about API Strat as well.
Okay.
Because we were both there, and that was pretty interesting. We could talk about some of the things we saw in terms of theming and things like that.
So the whole point of this is a Q&A type of thing. We don't come up with the content. People ask us questions, and we attempt to answer those questions live. That's the general idea. And we have on the Slack channel managed to get some questions to prime the pump, as it were. What was that API, the URL for people if they want to join the Slack channel, Glenn?
That's a good question. Now I've got to go back to.
I got it. It's slack.httpapis.com.
Do you want to tweet that, or should I tweet that?
You can tweet that whilst I bring up this first question that we had.
Perfect.
And this question, this is the kind of sad thing about when you only really know people via Twitter, when you only know their Twitter handles and you don't actually know what their name is. The question came from Asborn Jornu. Asborn. I don't even know how to pronounce that Twitter handle, but
we know him.
Yes, we know
Yes.
him very well and have lots of interesting hypermedia related conversations with him. And the
I don't think
question,
I'm wondering if I actually met, if he and I have known each other for like years, but I don't know if we've actually crossed paths or not in person.
the worst thing is when you find out you have crossed paths with somebody and you
I
never made the
know.
connection between the real
Yes.
person and the
So
Twitter
on that
handle.
note, which this is unplanned, unscripted, but you know, my basic strategy with that, because it was happening so often, it would be like, oh, by the way, I'd be like, oh, nice to meet you. Like, oh no, we met at such and such conference, and that was happening so many times that I started to say, nice to see you,
Yeah.
which could be like a again.
For the first time again.
No, I just say nice to see you, and then you like look at the facial, and then it's like it carries, you know, both implications of like
That's
great
what
to
they
meet you the
call,
first time, great to see you again.
it's what they call an idempotent greeting.
Ah, nice. We need to be applying HTTP in more aspects of our life, is really what you're
Absolutely.
saying.
Yes.
The HTTP lifestyle, how hypermedia will help your marriage.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure I'm going there. So, to the question, which is a bit of, you know, throwing gasoline on a fire, but the question
Oh, we like that. That's the only way we like to live.
specifically, the question was what is the impact of HTTP2's server push with relation to GraphQL? I mean, specifically, it says, how does HTTP server 2 push? Is it making it GraphQL obsolete? Which is a little even more incendiary. And Joseph Gardner followed up, he was going to ask the same question about embedding in compound documents. So I think this question as a whole is sort of, how does GraphQL and HTTP, and even more specifically HTTP2, interact? And
So I think
what are the relationships?
What is GraphQL?
Okay, I'll let you do that because I'll just say mean things.
So, you know, this is one of the things I think that has risen up in the last 2 years, you know, the GraphQL architectural style. Okay, no, it's not an architectural style. I needed to say that. But that, please, like, before we even just get into GraphQL, please stop comparing GraphQL and REST. It's just not very becoming. Don't do it. It's the wrong comparison. It's not an apples to apples comparison, right? It's like, should I buy a Schwinn bike or should I buy, you know, a skateboard? Like, they're two completely different comparisons. I just dated myself with the bicycle comment. But anyway, but I do think GraphQL is really interesting, and actually, you know, although I might lose a lot of street cred with my API purist crowd, I actually like GraphQL quite a bit. But what GraphQL is, if you go to graphql.org, GraphQL is a protocol of sorts, I guess maybe that's the way to think about it, that enables clients to richly query APIs, but it puts a layer on top of those APIs that provides a standard language for querying. And one of the ideas of the graph is that it embraces this idea that resources that you would query against are related. So you can do like a single query that pulls a whole, you know, kind of nested result back and joins across multiple resources. It also has a type system, so there's a tooling aspect there. One of the big things about GraphQL is actually about, and where I've seen the adoption. So first off, GraphQL originated at Facebook. Facebook has their mobile app, and the reason they went to build it, it wasn't like a, you know, a solution, you know, a solution looking for a problem. They did have a real problem, which is that their mobile client and the news feed for Facebook required a massive amount of queries to get the data back. And I think they did profiling, and the device with like the mobile device, when it would start up Facebook, it was doing something like 100 queries or something like that, individual queries. And so they realized that, you know, this is just not scalable. When you're dealing with a mobile device, you have to deal with battery life, things like that. And so they started to say, you know, what if we could come up with this standard way to expose, you know, the different data resources that we have within Facebook, and we could provide like a language that would allow the client to just specify like what kind of data that it wants, and it gets that data back. Now, some of you have heard of other things that have the same claim associated with them. And, you know, I would say that, yes, like there is definitely a similarity there. This is not the first thing to ever try to solve this problem. But one thing it does that's quite interesting is they care a lot about the user experience. And one of the goals that they were trying to enable, like once they got down this path, is realizing that this could decouple the UI teams from the backend teams, in the sense that if you look at a lot of companies that are utilizing APIs, there is this tension of like the UI has needs, demands on, you know, here's the kind of data that we need. And they have to go back and forth to the backend teams to build the endpoints that they need to be able to surface the data that is going to be in the UI. And so with GraphQL, what they tried to do, which again, they're not the first to do it, was say, like we can give our UX and our front end teams the ability to specify the shape of the data that they're going to get back. And this way, we don't have to build, and even things like applying filters, and give them a query language, you know, almost like SQL, right? Like querying against a database, only some richness in terms of the formatting, and we can give them some of the tooling benefits, like we can schematize this so that they can get strongly typed information to help them to kind of build out those queries and do the right thing. And you know, then it's going to enable those UI teams to be able to move a lot faster. But here's the other aspect: the backend APIs still exist. So where a lot of the GraphQL traction is happening is where it's not that they're looking at it like the only thing we have is a GraphQL endpoint, which is every single client that talks to us has to use GraphQL. No, what's really happening is like, hey, there are real APIs behind. Real is probably the wrong term, because somebody would say, "Oh, well, GraphQL isn't." There are
finely grained, right?
There are more fine-grained traditional APIs behind the scenes, and then GraphQL acts as a layer or a proxy to then query out to those things. So anyway, I just gave you the story of Facebook, which did this for the mobile device. But then once they built this, they decided to share it, and they said, you know, we're on to something, and they collaborated very heavily with the community. And that's the thing that I think really is a great story about GraphQL, is the fact that very early on, the GraphQL community of Facebook reached out and helped to, or the folks at Facebook that were working on GraphQL reached out and realized there's an opportunity here for the community, and the community was all over it, and they worked together very early on to evolve this, and then a whole ecosystem of libraries and things grew around it. The other thing to mention, which was not as prominent 2 years ago, is React. And so you can't talk about GraphQL without talking about React, because the app that, you know, Facebook was also the creator of React, which is, you know, this UX, very rich UX framework that's now kind of becoming de facto, and their UIs were all built with React. So there was a whole ecosystem that grew up around, hey, if you're building React applications, this is the way to do it. And once the community stepped in, they started to take things a lot further than where Facebook was going with it. And now, you know, if you look at the most popular GraphQL libraries, they're not coming from Facebook. There's actually like Apollo, which is one of the most popular GraphQL which I think is the most popular right now, which is actually created by Meteor folks. So that's a great story in the sense that community got in early, saw an opportunity, and some companies jumped in and ran with it. So anyway, I'm sure you will tear me down, but that's my story about GraphQL, and I'm not passing judgment on it. I'm just saying that, you know, it is certainly getting more and more traction.
Yes. So before we actually get to the question, I have two comments to that. One is, you obviously see the way that the community has interacted with this a little differently than myself. I kind of saw a spec being thrown over the wall and saying, look, this is what we did, and you should do this too. And then tool vendors jumped on it and said, well, here's a commercial opportunity because we know everybody's going to pick it up because Facebook are big.
Have you gone to the repo and seen where the spec discussions happen? Because it is not, maybe there's always there was an initial thing, sure, that they threw out there, but very early, lots of advocates and and people that were interested got involved, and there was an open discussion that was happening about where does this need to go. Okay. Which is what I think was a great story.
See, my first reaction early on when I saw it was, yeah, this has a lot of interesting things to it, but you should chop them up and break them into pieces so that they fit more nicely into the HTTP world. Create a media type for your queries. Create an independent type system. I like the type system because JSON schema has problems with describing a JSON type system. And rather than this being a protocol, as you described it, that sits on top of HTTP and covers up HTTP, why not make it extensible pieces that fit nicely into the HTTP world?
So being that we're all about controversy, I have a suggestion for you, Daryl, and you should. Yes. You probably know what it's going to be, but I'm going to say it anyway. Like right now, you're putting all your energy into the Open API spec. But really, I think, these ideas, basically, why not just engage in the conversation and try to bring it in that direction? Because I think there's openness. What I think is the danger is when you come to somebody with an idea like, hey, this thing is just crap, I'm going to show you the better way. But if you can actually talk about a value discussion, I don't see why it can't happen. I mean, as long as it's providing value and it works and it doesn't and people still get the same kind of perceived benefit.
Yeah, and I would love to see ways in which we can incorporate GraphQL APIs into an Open API description, because there still needs to be documentation, there still needs to be an API interface, there still needs to be that kind of, I want to try this API. And as I say, because it's built on HTTP, I see no reason why the two can't complement each other. It's just, that's not really the way it was presented when it was initially, the benefits of it were exposed. And to go back to the original problem that you were saying that they were trying to solve with the mobile client, my question to you is, do you think they were trying to solve the same problem that Netflix attempted to solve with their backends for front ends? This idea where your UX team actually built a custom backend for a particular use case scenario client, and then that backend for the front end then called a much more generic.
Well, but because you were saying the UX team built that. I think what they were really trying to do was not have the UX team building APIs, but letting the UX team or the UI team be able to query for the thing, get the data they need. So I think it's a little bit of a different strategy. I mean, it is a bit of a silver bullet.
But is it solving the same problem though, but just a different approach to the same problem?
I'm not as well familiar. Like, I remember that they created like a OData API for Netflix, and that thing got turned off. Are you talking about that or something completely different?
No, later on after that, I believe it was Daniel Jacobson who did a bunch of posts, and they talked about how they had one very large generic API, and then in front of that they had use case scenario based APIs that then would drive the UX. So the TV sets would have.
See. So I don't think it was the same. I don't think it was the same strategy though. Then, so that was actually about crafting what I'm hearing you say, which is of course a popular API strategy, is to say, well, maybe it's not as popular as it should be.
Oh, no.
That folks need to access my data, and instead of trying to give them one API to rule them all, then I can craft specific APIs that are tailored around their use cases. I think in this case, where GraphQL really came in was around data-driven, like surface data up to an application, and give them the flexibility of picking and choosing which fields they want to select so that the queries are more efficient in terms of how much data. Because a very common pattern that happens today too is like, you know, a lot of data will get pulled back and then the client will just display the fields that it needs, whereas GraphQL allows it to actually craft that and say, well, I only need 3 fields, so just send me 3 fields back. Again, not the first one that's ever done that. But no, I don't think it, I mean, I wasn't there, so I can't speak to it. I think it was really driven by, from what I understand, it was really driven by an urgency of like, our app is too slow and inefficient. We need to do something about it. I think that's really how this came about. It was like, it was a business problem. It was a suffering customer, because any customer that launched that app was waiting a long time to get data, draining their battery. I mean, so this provided real benefit. But yeah, I don't think it was, and again, I wasn't there, and you know, like Lee Byron would be the right person to talk to who knows about this stuff.
Look, but we could probably fill about 4 hours talking about this particular topic, but let's get ahead and attempt to address
HTTP2.
This HTTP2. What is this? What's the correlation between HTTP2 and GraphQL?
Sure. So my understanding is, you know, one of the key things, and I'm not the expert, but I'll throw in anyway because that never stops me. No, I'm kidding. From what I understand, and the discussion that we even had on the Slack, is, you know, HTTP2, one of the things that HTTP2 introduces is this ability to have like results, multiple results coming back in a single query, and you can be like interleaving results from multiple resources. One of the places that comes in is to help with UI, like when you have like images and other resources, but you can certainly use it for data as well. So one of the aspects of GraphQL is this idea of like, you have a single endpoint now that you can query that then behind the scenes is pulling data down from lots of different places. As a matter of fact, you remember Subbu years ago had the thing that he worked on at eBay, QL.io, I think, was a similar idea, except, yeah, I mean, there was similarities. But it was also different in the sense that clients there kind of defined the schema almost and sent it up to the server, and then the server knew how to query these different things. But yeah, I think that's the aspect, is this idea that you could include multiple results with HTTP2 from a single request. So conceptually, that need to pull down all those resources could happen more natively within HTTP2. Because one of the arguments you'll get against GraphQL is the fact that HTTP is all about this it's a layered protocol. It's all about intermediaries, middleware, all the things that we know and love, caches, proxies, or hate, depending, but it works. And because GraphQL, in the same way that SOAP was tunneling, there is a tunneling aspect to GraphQL. It's like the rest of the HTTP world has no idea that you're dealing with GraphQL. And again, getting back to what you said, there's no media type there. There's nothing that gives it the ability to say, you're GraphQL, I'll optimize this. So you lose a lot of that. So if you could bring something like HTTP2 in, you could get back some of that. But
yeah, I think
my other side to that is, go ahead.
The distinction there is with HTTP2 server push, those extra resources that come back. First of all, they come back as distinct responses. They're not embedded in as a single document.
Single response.
And secondly, they are controlled by the server. And I think this is a big part of the conversation. You talked a lot about how GraphQL was putting control into the client developer's hands to choose and select what information they want. Server push is a decision that's made by the server. When you go and get resource A, well, you probably will need resource B also. So I'm going to push B down as well.
So you could combine, I mean, you could technically, unless I'm missing something, I mean, you could have a contract with the client where the client can say, here's the things that I want, and the server just decides to use server push in HTTP2 as part of its response to deliver those things.
Well, yeah, you could layer on a whole new interaction protocol, but that, as I
Yeah.
understand it, is not how server
How it
push
works
is
today. No,
intended.
great. This is why when the conversation comes up of like, oh, will this replace GraphQL? I think by itself, no, but it could be part of, delivering something like GraphQL, or maybe GraphQL can embrace this such that it becomes more friendly and utilizing more native capabilities of HTTP instead of tunneling them.
Yeah. I think the important thing is that HTTP2 provides a different architectural approach
Sure,
to solving
the
the
same
problem of I've got 100 requests coming from my client. Now,
right.
From a perspective of a hypermedia Rastafarian, I think if you're doing 100 round trips from a
It's so great
client,
that you admit that. Admitting is half the problem.
yes, yes, I wear that badge with pride. I think you have an API problem if you're doing that. And the other perspective is, I think that it's the server that's closer to the data. The server understands the business logic. The server is in a much better position to make a lot of decisions about what data is useful and is needed. Whereas I know a lot of people come from a very different perspective of clients rule the world, which is really
Well,
ironic.
GraphQL still allow, I think one of the things that is interesting about the approach with GraphQL is it still does allow the server to define the universe of what is queryable. It's not like in the old days with OData, especially with like early on, it was very much like, here's your database and there's endpoints associated with them. And of course it evolved over time. Yes, I mentioned OData. So I think with GraphQL, like, this idea of a schema and the fact that the client doesn't own that schema, the server owns that schema, and the server can define like what is available when. And not only that, the server actually controls how to get it as well. Like this concept in GraphQL of resolvers, is not like with GraphQL, it's the implementations behind it. The servers don't tend to just automatically go and get anything. It's actually like, as you create your GraphQL server, like there are things you can use like Apollo Server, but you define like, here's how to get this resource, here's how to get this resource, which is actually a shift from, I think, a lot of the traditional approaches, which have been more like, we know how to get stuff, we provide a query language. So that, I think, is a difference from what I've seen, in terms of the approach of like, it still gives the server absolute control as to what is allowed. But yes, I mean, there is an empowering client's angle.
From a performance perspective, you're saying the client chooses the bits that it thinks that it needs in order to optimize for performance, whereas the other way around is the server is making optimizations.
I don't think from the client perspective it's so much about performance. I think Facebook, and again, I could be stepping outside myself here, or stepping outside of my the things I start to tell may be shaky, but my personal understanding of it is, that may have been the symptom that led to this, which was Facebook's problems. But the interest is not so much, I think, around the performance side. Like when people are getting all over it, it's just about that ability to efficiently specify the things that they want and get them back. Like whether it was one query.
You use the word efficiently there. Efficiently from what perspective?
I mean efficiently as I'm a developer and I don't need to make 5 calls, in terms of from the way I think about it. Like I just have a standard way of like creating a query and I send it somewhere and I get back the results I wanted. Like it may be that in fact it is super efficient under the hood because they've done it as a, single endpoint and all of that. But actually I don't really care. Like what I care about
is convenience to you, right?
Convenience. Yeah, that's what I mean by efficiency. My efficiency of development.
Okay, so expanding this whole concept a little bit further, because the question was about HTTP2 and embedding content and resources.
Yeah.
There are other media types like HAL, for example, which
allow you to embed.
Allow you to embed.
Sure.
I think we're in a situation here where HTTP2 push has the possibility of making that completely obsolete, and at a bigger scale, because you mean
But
Hal's not.
collection JSON has that as well, right? Which is that
Uh,
you have some level of embedding a common pattern in collection JSON. You might have like URLs to get things, and you have the ability. I know.
Yeah, you
Mike.
can add a small amount of information
Yeah,
in there, but I mean also from a browser perspective, there's lots of um, bundling and stuff that goes on, and preload capabilities, which are all been introduced as a way of trying to quickly get secondary content.
sure.
And this is HB2 just provides a whole new way of doing that with server push.
Yeah, so I think that especially that this is becoming a proper part of, or has with HTTP2, I think those conversations like with the GraphQL community of like, how can we make it so the kind of things that people are trying to do with GraphQL can embrace HTTP2 is a great thing. My only point too is that when people look at GraphQL, there's a lot of different aspects about it that are interesting, and the just saying, like, somebody who doesn't really like understand what GraphQL is could on face value be like, oh, that solves the problem, but it's like there's more to it than just the embedding of the resources in terms of the protocol and all that other stuff. And yes, there's certainly ways to do that in a more HTTP friendly proper way.
Would you think it's fair to describe it as SQL for the web?
GraphQL?
Yeah, or do you think it's a lot more than just SQL for the web?
Well, maybe SQL for APIs, because I think the thing is that SQL for the web implies this idea of I'm just taking a database and exposing it as a SQL query. To me, I think there's definitely that clear abstraction in GraphQL that where the data is coming from is, could be anywhere.
Right, but if you live in the database world, we have things like called views that are abstractions over the top of the physical
but views are more different. Yeah, but views are more, like I've got data in tables, but I materialize it in different ways in terms of how I combine it. My point is that there's no table notion in GraphQL that ties to any specific source of the data. But
it's a tree structure instead of a tabular structure, right?
No, but I mean, what is a resource is completely arbitrary in GraphQL. Like, it's up to you. Like, you define a type system, and where those types come from, whether it's coming from a document or making another API call, that's an implementation detail. Whereas with a database, like when you say that comment, and again, it depends on what you meant by it. But yeah, I do think it's a general query language for getting access to data that's on the web. So yeah, you could say from that respect.
So for people who are kind of new to the space, I know one of the things that has upset a lot of the people in the REST HTTP world was the way it was sort of presented as a way of solving a lot of REST problems. So people who are new to the space are going to come along and kind of feel faced with this, well, should I do REST or should I do GraphQL? And I think we both agree that that's not the right question. I mean, you started out saying that's not the right question. So what would you tell new people coming into the space as to how to make the decision of when should you use just regular APIs and when is GraphQL suited?
Well, I think the two are totally not mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, I was just in Buenos Aires at NodeConf Argentina. And I saw a very interesting talk about a company, and I can't remember their name right now, that they have a GraphQL endpoint that they built on top of their existing infrastructure, and they actually used OpenAPI as well. And their APIs are hypermedia APIs. So they basically wrote a tool, which was really cool, that allowed them using like OpenAPI specifications, and it thought of hypermedia as a related resource. And it builds up a GraphQL endpoint based on all that metadata, that the implementation of that GraphQL endpoint, like the resolvers and such, are actually walking links. Because
so it's dynamically driven from an API description.
So my point is, I think the two are not mutually exclusive. Now, there's a different question of which one to use when. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the place where it's clear, like I have, some friends working at some big companies that are really looking at GraphQL, and what I've seen at least is it's like, hey, we need to enable our UI teams to query the stuff that they need for, driving like data that gets displayed in the UI. They're looking to GraphQL for those use cases. What I don't think they're really looking to them for is like machine-to-machine type interactions. That being said, GitHub created a GraphQL API, and they also have, a more traditional REST or resource-based API. And one of the guys that works on my team, Bobby Johnson, recently built a back-end serverless tool that used the GraphQL API to query to get some data because it was just more efficient and easier to just create a GraphQL query that had the different results that he needed. So anyway, I think the two are not mutually exclusive, but one thing I think is like one big problem in the GraphQL community right now that a lot of people raise, especially those coming with more of a HTTP angle, is about caching. The caching stories, there's private caches on clients, there's private caches on servers, but there's a lot of caching like middleware of the web that you just kind of lose in the GraphQL world. Whereas if you were building the analogous, so, if you look at Hypermedia, like with Hypermedia, I could basically return a result that has a bunch of links that go off to other resources. But the difference between that and the GraphQL version is when I do this with Hypermedia, I now get the benefit of leveraging the caches because those are actual calls out to completely separate resources that there's visibility in the web. So, I would say if you care a lot about caching, that's going to be one thing to think about and say that, hey, if I go down the GraphQL route, I'm going to lose the benefit of a lot of the HTTP caches that exist and infrastructure.
Well, I mean, you say if you care a lot about caching. Technically, nobody really cares about caching. People care about performance, right?
Oh, fair enough.
Right.
Good point.
So there
well, and even there, it's like you're not losing it completely because if your GraphQL API, like in the example I gave, I think it was Medallia was the company, is actually going and talking to another API, then you are getting one layer of caching that you are leveraging in the sense that your GraphQL endpoint is a proxy against another API, and those calls are leveraging caching, right. But the calls against the GraphQL API itself are losing some of the benefits. And there are some vendors that are trying to solve that problem in a GraphQL specific way.
Yes, which makes me a little sad.
Based on the state of things, yeah.
Yes, because we all know that caching is pretty hard, and cache invalidation is even harder.
Agreed.
So I think for at least for this week, we've beaten the GraphQL thing.
Yes, we have. But it was a very good. It was a good, interesting conversation.
It was good to get off our chest.
And you and I have lived continually in controversy, and this just continues the tradition. There's no shortage of for listeners who are not familiar with GraphQL. There is certainly quite a bit of controversy around it, but what I can say on the other side, and like I said, I like a lot of the ideas there, is the fact that it has gained quite a lot of traction, and it is gaining more and more traction. So it's one of those things where I think it's a train that's moving and it's not going to stop. So if you come at this from, oh, I don't like the way they're doing it, whatever, it's like, well, the train is moving anyway.
Yep.
So what I would say is, like, if you care about trying to guide it in another direction, one, you need to base that in a value discussion. Two, you need to get involved.
Getting involved is definitely something that everybody should do more. So we're pretty much close to the end of this thing. I had a few little HTTP nuggets of information that I wanted to share along with here. And the first one is actually related to this topic in a way. We talked a little bit about this notion of preloads. The idea of the preload link is a web page would say, preload this content because we think that the user is going to go and do this, so that it can be there in advance, locally cached. There's a new alternative to doing preload, which is currently in draft state, and it's called Early Hints. And it uses a rather unusual technique within HTTP, which is one of the 100 class HTTP headers. Probably most people have never seen 100 class headers. We do have one of them that does get used sometimes, which is the 100 continue header, which is just kind of a little negotiation that is used to prevent clients from sending payloads that are way too large to a server. And they're unusual because they're status codes that go back to the client before the actual response is returned back to the client. So this new early hint, so the idea is you would make a request to a server to say, I would like this resource back. And before getting the regular response headers back, you'd get this early hints 103 status code with some other headers that say, you're probably going to get these headers in the final response, but I'm going to tell you this information early so that you can do stuff with it. And in fact, what you can do with those early hints is include links like, oh, by the way, here's the CSS that you're going to need in order to process this HTTP response. So all the different things that it might be used for, I'm not completely aware of. And it introduces a whole new stage of processing into the request response, because it's no longer just I'm making a request and now here's a response. It's I'm making a request and now here's some information that's going to tell you some information about the response that you're going to get, and now here's actually the response. So it will be interesting to see whether that makes it into final accepted RFC status, and it will also be interesting to see whether what people do with it. So that's the. So
I have a header tidbit as well, which I don't remember how I came across it. I think it was actually in the HTTP Slack, which just a plug for that. That's more and more people are starting to get involved with that Slack. I noticed Mark Nottingham is working on another header, which I think it's a way of saying that this resource is going to be deprecated in the future.
That's Eric Wild's Sunset header.
Oh, the Sunset header. Okay. Well, I think I saw Mark mentioning it. So it's Eric Wild. Apologies. Can you talk a little bit about that one? Because you obviously know more about it.
I don't know a lot of the details other than what is obvious from it. It's a case of, it's a way of adding a response header to say, yes, this resource is here, it's good, here's a representation, but you probably don't want to depend on this for long term because we're going to make it go away at some point in the future.
Which is interesting. You know, why I think it's interesting is that one of the powers of HTTP, and we're continuing to see that, is evolvability. We always talk about that. HTTP was built for evolvability, and it's not just evolvability in terms of resources and returning different payloads. It's things like the semantics of HTTP itself. And of course, we see this with, you know, HTTP 1 and HTTP 1.1, and HTTP 2 doesn't really change a lot of the semantics of HTTP. But I think the fact that we're able to, you know, as an industry, as we evolve and new challenges are arising, and just we're learning more, like maybe those challenges have been there forever, like the need for the sunset header, but nobody thought about it. And now somebody thought about it, and it's like there's a means to get that kind of thing in, and without breaking all the clients of the world. That to me is really one of the beautiful things about HTTP.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to stop thinking of HTTP APIs as something that you release in kind of interrupted segments. It's something that just lives forever, and this kind of gets into the whole versioning life cycle. But once you have a successful API, you're stuck with it for quite a long time. So learning how to
and just to be controversial, you know, there's all your versioning problems go away when you have GraphQL endpoints.
Just no, not. We do not have enough time to go even close to that
I
today.
just thought I would drop that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Glenn. So the other little header tidbit I had was a very old HTTP header concept, which are called trailer headers. There's a HTTP header called trailer, and you in the trailer header you say, oh, by the way, these other headers you're not going to get until after the body. And it hasn't really been supported and hasn't really been used by very many tools, I think primarily because of a lack of browser support for it in the past. My understanding is it is used a lot more behind CDNs and behind caches and stuff, but on the front end it hasn't been used too much. But recently, the Fetch API within browsers have started to expose trailer headers. So this allows you to now send a response, send the headers that come first, and then send the body, and then send some additional headers. And that's really useful for things like calculating e-tags and checksums and signatures and dates and things like that, where you will have time-sensitive information. Or if you have a streaming response and you want to say, okay, yeah, but there's some errors that occurred whilst doing that streaming response. So trailer headers are something that I'm hoping we start to see more of in the near future.
Great. Well, that sounds like there's a lot of interesting things happening in the HTTP world.
Yeah, we look like dinosaurs, but we keep inventing new stuff.
Well, that's a testament to to HTTP itself.
That's right.
One thing I just wanted to mention. So Jeff, who's my coworker, he mentioned Falcor. So we don't need to go into it, but just throw it out there that Falcor is a different approach to, to the problem that GraphQL is trying to solve. It was created by Netflix, and one of the things that Jeff was pointing out, thank you, Jeff, was that caching is something, support for caching and invalidation and things like that are more central to Falcor.
Okay, we have so many options, so many choices to choose from.
We do.
Well, we attempted to revive In the Mood for HTTP. We'll see whether or not we were successful or not. And if people have more questions that they want us to address on the next episode, hit us up with lots of questions. The next episode will depend on how fast and furious questions come. Once we have a sufficient cache of questions, we'll have another episode, right, Glenn?
Yes, and I think one thing to mention is that we're now really embracing Slack fully as our means to communicate with us. We're also going to launch a Twitter account, so you'll be able to tweet us with questions, and we'll see that pop up in the Slack using an integration. But if you really want to engage with us, join the Slack, join the In the Mood for HTTP channel within the HTTP Slack. And maybe, Daryl, one of the things we could do, being that we're going to be using Slack, we could actually create a post in Slack where we can collect questions. So, this way it can be a document that we can just pin, and people can just go in there and just write their questions right in the Slack, or we can add them if they come through Twitter. But thanks everybody for listening. And Daryl, I'm really excited that we're getting this off the ground again. It sounds like from all the people I spoke to that they were like, yeah, we need this. We need this to keep going.
Well, and if people ask us interesting questions, maybe we can keep the content interesting also. And we're going to stick with this time, right?
Maybe we can have a couple of guest speakers on as well.
Well, that would add some spice.
Awesome.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Talk to you next time.
Yes, I will be in the mood for HTTP.
As always.